Hello everyone, and welcome to a Chapter 4 screencast. We'll be going through slides 1 through 24. So I'm going to skip these first couple slides. They just talk about what we're focusing on in Chapter 4. And we get to what is a tissue. So this digs back to our structural organization of our body. And so like we mentioned in class, we start off with atoms that build upon one another. We get molecules. Molecules come together and we create organelles, which we find within our cells. And then when we have cells come together and they're basically built the same and they do the same function, then they become a tissue because they're all working together. And there are four major tissue types in our body. We have connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue, and lastly epithelial tissue. So you'll see examples of all these in the following slides. So first we have connective tissue, and there's a variety of connective tissues within our body, but basically it comes down to all types of connective tissue will bind and support our body, or parts of our body rather. So you don't want your stomach to be able to move over to the right side of your abdomen. No, you want it to stay put in the upper left quadrant. You don't want an artery every time blood is moving through it to be moving around. Instead, it keeps it kind of binded to a secure location, and the blood can easily pass through that blood vessel. So connective tissue within it has some specialized cells. Specifically, we'll be looking at some fibroblasts. Those are cells within our connective tissue. We'll have ground substance, which ground substance is, I always kind of say it's in the background of the connective tissue. We don't have cells that are a part of our ground substance. It could be anywhere from a solid to a fluid-like substance. And then we also have some protein fibers as well. And we could break down connective tissues into three different types. We have our fibrous connective tissue, and that will be broken down into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue, which we'll look at closely in the next slides. And then we have supportive connective tissue broken down into bone and cartilage. And then we have our fluid connective tissue broken down into blood and lymph, which is a special fluid that we'll discuss in a moment. So our fibrous connective tissue is broken down into two different types. We have dense connective tissue and loose connective tissue. If you look at this image on the right, we see a slide of loose fibrous tissue, connective tissue. And in here we see these, they're little purplish round oval parts of the tissue. Those are representing fibroblasts. Fibroblasts will help to maintain the connective tissue. We also see some elastic fibers. Those are going to be these skinny, darker lines, almost like a dark purple. Okay, and then you'll see these thicker pink lines in the back, and that's going to be the collagen. And that's basically what the structure of fibrous connective tissue is, are those components. And so we could see that this is loosely arranged. This is also loosely arranged. This is obviously an illustration here. And it'll help to support epithelial tissue that we'll talk about at the end of all of our tissue types and a lot of our internal organs. You can also see that a type of connective tissue is adipose tissue made up of adipose cells. So here we see this cell is going to store fat. All of this yellow in here is fat. We have so much fat within the cell that it actually pushes over the nucleus to the edge of the cell to one side. So you'll always kind of see this like ring-like structure surrounding the fat droplet in the center. And I forgot I have all of these highlighted for you. Okay, so then we move into dense connective tissue, and there are two different types here. We have our regular dense, which you can see when we look at a tissue slide, all of the collagen fibers are really nicely parallel to one another. We even have these fibroblasts paralleled in between the collagen fibers, neatly organized. Whereas the irregular tissue, this has no I don't want to say no structure to it, but it has no organization to it. It's just in a disarray. All of this reddish in here are the collagen fibers, and then you see the fibroblasts are just randomly placed amongst that collagen. So we get over to our supportive connective tissue, and that is going to be our cartilage and bone. So we'll start off with cartilage, and in our cartilage we have the cells within the tissue are the chondroblasts. And I know I wrote this out for, I think, one of my classes, but I don't think I wrote it out for everyone. So here's chondroblasts. Of course, I choose the bright color. Chondro means cartilage, and blast means like a building cell. So actually, we should really just call this a chondrocyte. Cyte means cell. So this is a cartilage cell. And that's what this guy in here is, if I outline it. So that's my chondrocyte. And then your chondrocyte lives within a lacuna. So this outer border here that I'm tracing with pink, that's the lacuna. So the chondrocyte lives in the lacuna. And then that is kind of interspersed within the matrix, which is all of this region in here. I'll highlight it with the green so you can kind of see this in the background here. And this is just another illustration of a lacuna, and this one happens to have 2 chondrocytes within it. So there are 3 different types of cartilage. We have hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. This image displays for us hyaline cartilage. So you can see the chondrocytes are just randomly kind of dropped into the matrix. There are very fine collagen fibers. You can kind of see them in the background back in here, that light pink. And we're going to find hyaline cartilage in the areas of our nose and at the ends of our long bones. And remember, this is going to be the cartilage that becomes inflamed or wears down when somebody has arthritis. And also, it used to be your fetal skeleton, meaning when you were a fetus, your entire body, I shouldn't say entire body, but your entire skeleton as you know it now was once hyaline to begin with. And then we have elastic cartilage. And once again, we have the chondrocytes. And here, this is a little difficult to see because it's a little light, but right in here is your chondrocyte. I'll give you another example. This is one that's splitting, but there's a chondrocyte. And then here too, we still see the lacunae. I think I used magenta last time. I don't know if we're going to see this well, but there is the lacuna, its home that it lives in. And the lacuna in this one, since it's split in 2, would be all around here. And so the big difference that we find in this type of cartilage is that we have all of these purple fibers extending on out, and these purple fibers are the elastic fibers, and that just gives us a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more elasticity to this type of cartilage. So the main place we will find it is our outer ear, or what's known as the pinna of the external ear. And then we have fibrocartilage. And fibrocartilage is going to be have very strong collagen fibers. So that's all of the pink that we see back in here. These are all representing collagen fibers. And in between them, you could see these darker purple blobs are going to be the fibroblasts. And the areas that we find fibrocartilage will be intervertebral discs, or the discs between the vertebrae that I showed you in class, or in the interpubic disc, and that's a disc that sits between the 2 hip bones, and that joint will only move in females during childbirth. So let's move into bone. So within our bone, we also have special named cells here, and these are now going to be called osteocytes. Osteo meaning bone, and cyte meaning cell. And these osteocytes live within a lacuna as well. Now this is a little bit smaller to see, but this dark portion is going to be the osteocyte. Okay, and in here, this is too small for us to see, but you would find an osteocyte in here in that pink portion. because we have two different types of bone. And then the lacuna, I'll outline in green, would just be going right around that cell. Okay, same thing here. It just kind of outlines that cell. It's the home of the cell, the lacuna. Okay, so beyond that, beyond these cells, we have a solid and rigid matrix because it's bone, right? And so that's going to be made up of collagen and calcium salts in order to give it strength. And we see at the top here is compact bone, and we see circular units. In class, I mentioned to some of you that they look like rings of a tree trunk. And so we call these osteons. So here's one osteon. You could kind of see it separated out. Here is another great osteon. Okay, and the other ones are a little bit harder to distinguish. Here's another one. This one's kind of cut at an irregular angle, but you get the point of what that looks like. And in the center of the osteon, we are going to have that really darkened portion. So this right in here, I'll fill it in with the yellow. That is going to represent a blood vessel. This is called our central canal, and in it we have an artery and some other fun stuff that we'll get into later. And so where we're going to usually find compact bone is in the shaft of the long bones, and I'll show you that in an image in a moment. Before we do that, let's talk about spongy bone. So spongy bone has these irregular plates that hit one another, and when people look at a tissue slide of spongy bone, they get a little confused what part is bone. So it's this pink portion that I'm kind of scribbling in with purple. That is the actual bone portion. And then all of the white that you see here, that's going to be the space. And we find spongy bone within the ends of long bones. So let me switch here. And do I have a way to clear the screen? Okay, perfect. So at the very top, at the end of the long bone, you see this is the spongy bone. So you'll see these little holes, these spaces amongst that bone. And then if you look at the shaft, or as this bone is heading down to be the shaft over here, that is compact bone. And now we move into fluid connective tissue. The first one will be blood, and it's made up of a fluid matrix, which we call plasma. So you can kind of think of the plasma as this yellow stuff back in here. And we have a bunch of different things in plasma, like ions and plasma proteins that we won't get into just yet. We'll save that for chapter 6, I believe it is. But the main components that we do want to know are our three formed elements. So that's going to be the red blood cells, which would be these cells over here. They're biconcave. They have that reddish appearance. And these are really important in carrying oxygen to our cells and tissues. So they have an important molecule, hemoglobin, that will bind oxygen and will be able to do that. The other type of cells, oh, and I forgot to mention, they're called erythrocytes. Erythro means red, so that's how they got the name. With our white blood cells, also called leukocytes, and you guessed it, leuko means white, they're a lot larger cells, and there's a couple different types of white blood cells, which we'll get into chapter 6 again, but they are going to be in charge of our immune defenses. So anytime you get sick, whether it's with a virus or bacteria, fungal, these white blood cells are going to come to your defense and try and save your body from that pathogen. And then lastly, we have the platelets, and these are called thrombocytes. Thrombo meaning clot. So these cells help us with blood clotting. So when you have a blood vessel that gets cut open and you start bleeding, these platelets go on over to that area and plug it up. And we get to our next fluid connective tissue, which is lymph. And lymph is going to be, you could think of it as like the extra fluid within your body. We're going to get into more detail when we go into our lymphatic and immune systems, so I don't want to dive in too deep just here, just yet. But We have our lymph nodes within our body. So most of you know that you have lymph nodes within your neck. Another very important area where you have lymph nodes is in your axilla, under your armpit, or in your armpit, and also the groin region. So if you get sick, those areas, usually in the neck is where you notice it the most, will be where you have swollen nodes. And what it's doing is it's taking the fluid from a percentage of the fluid from your blood and moving it through the lymphatic system. And it's checking there for microbes to see if anything harmful is in there. And when it does, then it can release the white blood cells, or lymphocytes to be specific. That's a type of white blood cell. You can see that there's many in this region to fight that pathogen that's causing the infection or sickness. So now we get into muscle tissue. So I really love the muscle tissue because it's so organized. There's only 3 different types, so it's pretty easy to, it's pretty easy to understand. So most of you already know that the muscle tissue is going to allow our body to move, and it's made up of muscle fibers or muscle cells. And so I want you to think of the structure of the cell as you know it from chapter 3, but this is a really specialized cell, and it's going to look different depending on which type of muscle tissue it's in. And we're also going to have special protein fibers called actin and myosin. And we'll discuss these more in our chapter that goes into detail on the muscular system. So the 3 different types that we have are your skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. So let's compare those to one another. Your skeletal muscle is going to be striated, which means that we have these protein fibers that are shaded a little bit different colors. And so when your muscle cell contracts, you're going to see these colors kind of move into one another, and this one cell will become a lot darker for reasons that we'll talk about in your muscular system chapter. But what you can notice here is that these cells are going to be pretty long. They are also cylindrical cells, and I wish we had a little bit more of a zoomed out picture for you to see the entire cell. So this is still just one cell, and it's cut off at the sides here. This too is one cell, and it's cut off at the sides here. And what you may have noticed is that there are several nuclei. And so we say these skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated, meaning they have many nuclei. And you're going to find them usually in places where they'll attach to bone to help us move. So you can think of your biceps brachii, or your, this is a picture, I believe, of the knee on the side. This is your, they have really interesting names like your fibularis longus and your gastrocnemius and tibialis anterior. If you want to know what a muscle's name is on your body, just let me know and I will teach you that. But we have a ton all throughout our body, and they're all going to have voluntary movement as long as they're skeletal muscle, meaning that you have conscious control over that muscle. You want to contract your biceps in order to flex at your elbow? You could do that just by thinking about it. Next, we have smooth muscle, and these muscle cells are really interesting because they have a spindle shape to them, which means that they are kind of fat in the middle. So we could see a good one here. They're fat in the middle, but they kind of taper out at the ends, just like that. So that's one smooth muscle cell. The other thing you can see is that there's only one nucleus per cell, and it's usually centrally located in the middle. And we don't see any striations here, which is why it got its name as smooth muscle, because we don't see the striations. And the areas we're going to see this are in the walls of hollow organs. So we have the example here of the intestines, the stomach is another one, the large intestines, and we need muscle here to be able to contract and move food along our GI tract, but we can also find them in our blood vessels, and that'll help with vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Remember, if we have just to review what this means if you don't understand those terms, if I have a blood vessel and I cut it in half and we look at it, and this is the normal diameter of that blood vessel, if I say I have that blood vessel vasodilate, it means that I'm making that opening larger. So the muscle that goes around here is relaxing and it's allowing that vessel to open on up. But if I say the blood vessel is going to vasoconstrict, then that means that tube is going to become a lot smaller. So the muscle at this point, you could think of the fibers as kind of like blending into one another, and that is going to make it smaller, causing you to have higher blood pressure here. Okay, my muscle fibers look kind of funky around there, but you get the idea. And this is going to be involuntary movement, meaning we don't have conscious control on this. So you can't, eat a hamburger and think, okay, intestines, get to work, contract, digest this food for me. And next we have your cardiac muscle tissue, and this we're going to find solely in the heart. And you'll see in this image, these will be striated muscle tissue. So we see that once again. And then the other thing that's very different of our cardiac muscle cells is that it is branched. And this might be a little bit difficult to see, but we have maybe a branch over here, and then it kind of goes down this way and up like this. So we have a branching this way and that way. This looks like another one here where it's a little branched. Okay, so that's what we mean by branched. It kind of has this irregular way about it. And it also has a single nucleus. It might be either in the center or it might be off to the side like we see over here. And the other interesting thing that's different from all other muscle tissue are these intercalated discs. So these darkened portions here, okay, so you see this one here, I'm just going to draw a line through it, one over here, there's another one over here and here. These intercalated discs are where we see gap junctions. Remember, those were the holes, kind of like the pores where ions can move through from one cell to another. If you didn't know what gap junctions are, go back into chapter 3 and learn what they are, okay? Because that might be on your test. So that allows the ions to move through from cell to cell. So when we have that ion movement, it lets the cardiac muscle cells contract all together to get our heart pumping correctly. And this, of course, is involuntary movement. We don't think, okay, heart beat, contract. But of course, if you have thoughts maybe that are anxiety provoking, like if you think about something really stressful, it might cause your heart rate to increase, and then your cardiac muscle tissue will, of course, be working harder. And then we get to nervous tissue. And nervous tissue I also really like because it's pretty simple to understand. Nervous tissue is important because we need to have communication all throughout our body. We need sensory input, whether that is something we're seeing with our eyes, whether it's our hands feeling if something is really hot, or sound waves coming into our ear, the sense of smell, taste, all of that is sensory input. And our integration of data means that we're giving that information to our brain, or maybe it's a reflex within our spinal cord, and that's allowing our body to respond in a certain way, and that's going to be our motor output. So within our nervous tissue, we're going to have two major types of cells. We have neurons, which are neurons. Let's see. Yes, I do have pictures, so I won't draw it out. So neurons are going to be your main players. I always call your neurons the celebrities. And the neuroglia, or these are also called glial cells, I call them your like entourage or your glam squad, because they're really helping to support the neurons. So here's glial cells is the other name that they're called. So let's move on and learn about them. So neurons will have these extensions coming out of them, and this will be a dendrite. And through these dendrites, they can pick up information. So whether that's sensory information or it's information coming from another neuron, it all comes here to the dendrite. The cell body is where you're going to find all the organelles that you're used to seeing in a cell. So we see the nucleus here, you'll have rough ER in here, mitochondria. That's where, the main mass of the cell is. And then extending from that is the axon. And the axon moves out toward the axon terminals. And so what's happening here is the dendrite is picking up information and it's sending it through the cell body, through the axon to the very end so that it can communicate with either the effector organ. So let's say it's a muscle, it'll tell the muscle to contract, or it can go to another neuron so that it could travel to where it needs to go. And this is a micrograph of a neuron. So you can see the cell body is over here, the nucleus and these dendrites sticking out, as well as the axon. The other thing I want to mention in this picture are these little, let's call them like hot dog buns around the axon, and they are kind of protecting and insulating the axon, and this allows for the information to pass through a lot faster through something called saltatory conduction. You do not have to know what that is for this chapter, but we will talk about it in our nervous system chapter. Okay, so next we'll discuss neuroglia, and remember these were the cells that are kind of like the entourage or the glam squad because they support the neuron, the celebrity. And we have a bunch of different types. Microglia is one type, oligodendrocytes, astrocytes. They're not pictured here, but we also have Schwann cells and satellite cells and epidermal cells. Those are all the neuroglia that exist that we know of. You do not have to know the different names of them, just know that they support neurons, and there's a lot more neuroglia than there is neurons. There's about a 9-to-1 ratio. So kind of think of your celebrities. There's that one celebrity, but they have a lot of supporters. They have their makeup artists, they have their hairstylists, they have their clothing stylists, they have their nutritionist and their exercise trainer, and the list goes on, right? So let's move on into our epithelial tissue next. So what's different about epithelial tissue is that they are cells that are very packed tightly together. So you can kind of see from the images down here that there's no space in the way that we usually see connective tissue, or nervous tissue has a little bit more space as well. And where we're going to find these cells are in body cavities, body surfaces, or in glands. And all of these cells will be anchored onto a basement membrane. So what that means is if we're looking at some cells, let's look at the simple cuboidal one. At the very bottom here is the basement membrane so that these cells have something firm to grasp on. And then the other side we're going to call the free side. So this is either going to be facing the external environment. So if you look at the top of your skin, that's the free side. Or if you think about your esophagus, the tube on the inside of your esophagus is the free side. So it's open to something usually. And the appearance, the name of the tissue is based on the appearance. So we'll talk on the next couple slides how we name these tissues. So here we have our first term that we're going to use to name tissues. And we name it based on the number of cell layers. So first is our simple term, and that just means we have one layer of cells. You can kind of see this here. Pseudostratified, before we talk about pseudostratified, this is an example of a simple layered epithelial tissue. So we have simple squamous. You can see there's just one layer of these cells, and we'll talk about what squamous is on the next slide. Here we have pseudostratified cells. And what I want you to understand about pseudostratified is one, that pseudo means false or fake, and stratified, if you look down here, means more than one layer of cell. So what that means is it looks like it's many layers, but it's actually just one layer. So if you look at our image here, I'm going to draw, here's our basement membrane, right, where the cells are on firmly. And I should choose another color that stands out. But if we look at each one of these cells, they all make contact with the basement membrane. So there's one there. This looks like another one here. And I'll just do one more. So you could see that that whole cell all has contact with that basement membrane. Now the reason why these cells look like they're many layers is because their nuclei are all kind of all over the place. We have some that are down low. We have some that are up high. And so you think that there's many layers, but there's only just one. And next we have stratified. So stratified means we have more than one cell layer. And let me show you where the basement membrane is on this image, because this is an image of your skin, the very top layer of your skin, the epidermis. So here's my basement membrane. And you could see many, many cells layered on top of one another until you get to the surface of your skin. So that would be the surface of your skin here. So that we use the term stratified for. Now let's talk about the second word there when we name epithelial tissue. The second word will usually be the shape of the cell. So first we have cuboidal, meaning cube-shaped. So if you look at this image here, you could see that these cells are square-shaped, cube-shaped, so we call it cuboidal. Next we have columnar. So here's the pseudostratified again. But we could see that most of these cells are column-shaped, and we also could notice that all of these cells are making contact with the basement membrane, and that's why it gets its name pseudostratified. It looks like it's many layers because these nuclei are all over the place, whereas when we look at, let's say, the columnar, see how the nuclei are nicely all next to one another? Okay. And then we have, oh, this was another example of columnar. So this is what simple columnar would look like, and once again notice how all the nuclei are kind of right at the same level, most of them at least, and we see that each cell is making contact with the basement membrane and it's one layer, so we're going to call this simple columnar. And then lastly we have the squamous, which means flat. So these cells are very flat. If I were to, actually we're going to draw them on one of the next slides, so I won't draw it, but you could see that they're very flat. Remember I was showing you some examples of the tissue assignment, and someone had taken a picture of eggs, and so the yolk was representing the nuclei and the rest of the egg was the cytoplasm of the cell. So here are some examples of where you're going to find these cells. Here's simple squamous. So again, just one layer of flat cells. Simple means one layer, squamous means flat. And we're going to find this in the area of the lungs. So this is important. I'll just go into detail on this one to kind of have it all make sense. But if we look at the air sacs in our lungs, we want those cells to be nice and flat. And the reason we have that, let me just draw an air sac here real quick. Okay, here's my one layer of flat cells going all around, and in here would be the air that we breathe in, and then surrounding this air sac would be a blood vessel. So here's my blood vessel. And so what we want is the oxygen that we have, that we breathe in, we want that to be easily moved out of this air sac and into the blood vessel. So do you think we would want layers of cells here, stratified epithelium? No, we want simple squamous, one layer of flat cells, so this oxygen can easily pass through that tissue and get into our blood. And then we have simple cuboidal epithelium. These you could see they create tubules. So here's one tube that when we cut it in half, you're kind of like looking at the top end of a straw. It creates a tube for the urine to move through, and we're going to have ions moving back and forth between the tubules and blood vessels, and we'll get more into that in the urinary system. So a lot of absorption is going to take place here. And this is a nice image of what it looks like, kind of one of the tubes cut in half. So you could see all those cuboidal cells lined up. Down here we see simple columnar epithelium. They're nicely aligned up next to one another, and we find this lining the small intestines. Once again, we have these cells here because they're going to help to absorb nutrients within our intestines, which is very important for us. And then we have our pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Now, we haven't talked about that term ciliated as far as tissues just yet, but what that means is on top of each of these cells, we're going to have these cilia that stick up, and they help to kind of move substances across. So a lot of people call pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium respiratory epithelium because we're going to find it lining the trachea as well as some of our other respiratory passageways, and it'll sweep any impurities that we have in our trachea or your windpipe up toward your either oral cavity for you to cough out, or it'll kind of swing it back toward your esophagus so you can swallow it, and your digestive system will kind of take over from there as far as getting rid of anything bad. And then we have your stratified squamous epithelium, and that's going to be this top layer right in here, or you could see it in this layer. They've kind of illustrated for you. And one of the reasons we have stratified squamous epithelium on our skin is because our skin renews every 30 days. So you're going to slop off these top layers, and these bottom cells will go through mitosis or cell division, and you'll get the newer ones that'll kind of move through the chain here and eventually move up closer to the top. And the same cycle will happen over and over again. And we'll find this type of tissue in all other places where we'll have that same type of sloughing off of the top layer of the epithelium, like the lining of your nose, mouth, esophagus, the anal canal, and vagina. So it really helps to protect us against any abrasions or any microbes that would enter into our body. So in your lecture notes that I gave you a copy of, and I'll also have that posted on Blackboard, I have a list of the different types of epithelium. And what I'd like for you to do is to kind of go through one by one, and you just want to draw these for yourself. Like I mentioned in class, you are not turning in these notes to me. They are just purely for your use to study, but this is a good way to review of what they should look like. So simple meaning one layer. I'm just going to do a couple here so you get the idea. Cube-shaped cells, and I'm drawing the nuclei in the middle. But if we had something, let's say stratified, like stratified columnar epithelium, then I'm going to draw many layers, right? More than one layer of my my cube-shaped cells. Okay, there are my cube-shaped cells, and of course I draw nuclei on the center of each of these. So you get the idea. This would be a good way to review. So that brings us to our integumentary system. Your integumentary system includes your skin as well as accessory glands or accessory organs like your hair, nails, and other glands that we'll discuss in the coming slides. And there are two major regions of our skin, and that's going to be your epidermis and your dermis. So just these two right here are a part of your skin. When you add in this bottom layer, known as your hypodermis and also as your subcutaneous layer or subcutaneous tissue, then you would call all of this, not really good with my bracket here, but you would call all of this your integumentary, I'm just going to abbreviate here, system. Okay, integumentary spelled up here for you. So these three layers together are your integumentary system. Just the epidermis and dermis is a part of your skin. And we also have internal structures where we're going to have fat stored. We have blood vessels in here, nerve fibers, hair follicles, sebaceous glands, sweat glands, and all of these are working together to help maintain homeostasis. So we're going to talk more about what our skin does for us. So your skin is going to protect all of your insides here from any trauma, invasion, or invasion by pathogens, and any water loss. We want to prevent all that. It's also going to help us regulate our body temperature. When we talked about homeostasis, I mentioned how your blood vessels can bring your blood closer to the surface of your skin, and so that heat can radiate off in order to cool your body down just in case you get too warm. Another thing is, in the skin, we have a lot of sensory receptors. Think about how your skin helps you detect pain if you touch something sharp, or hot if you touch, let's say, a stove or a hot cup of coffee, or something really cold if you were to touch snow with your bare hands. There are a ton of receptors in there that are also there for light touch, vibration, and deep pressure, so that it gives your body a clue so that it can respond properly. And we also have our skin synthesizing certain chemicals like melanin, which we'll talk about when we discuss skin cancer, and vitamin D. Okay, so this is going to end right here, and there's another part of the screencast for the rest of the slides. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to contact me, and good luck studying for your exam.